All right, welcome back for our second panel conversation today on the very important topic of housing, to be chaired by Saul Eslake with Maiy Azize, Alan Kohler and Tim Helm. Saul, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. With the possible exception of climate change, there's no contemporary issue that better embodies the intergenerational inequity of which Ken Henry spoke so eloquently earlier this morning than housing. To give one illustration of that, the 2021 census showed that the home ownership rate among people under the age of 45 was back to where it had been in 1947 and 1954. Even among people aged between 45 and 54, who could hardly be considered young, the home ownership rate is back to where it was in 1961. The only demographic among whom home ownership rates haven't fallen since the national home ownership rate peaked in 1966 are people over the age of 65, who constitute a much bigger proportion of Australia's population now than they did then, which is why the overall home ownership rate appears not to have fallen very much from its peak of 72% at the 1966 census to its most recent level of about 66. There's an awful lot of ice under the tip of that berg. As an economist, I can't help but say that the housing crisis which we now face, not only for homeowners, but also importantly for renters, is the result of a persistent mismatch between the demand for housing and the supply of it. Today's conversation isn't really about housing supply matters, although, like most economists and many others who have an interest in this, we agree that doing something to boost housing supply is an important part of finding solutions. I think one of our speakers is going to say something about housing supply, but the point that I think is often overlooked, including by a majority of economists these days, I regret to say, is the role that public policy has played in needlessly inflating the demand for housing. And I've been saying for 45 years that it isn't a coincidence that the home ownership rate peaked in 1966, because that was the first census after what I regard as a pivotal turning point in Australia's attitude to housing policy, because it came after the introduction of the first home owners grant scheme by the Menzies government in 1964, which had been promised by the Menzies government in 1963 at the urging of the New South Wales Young Liberals, whose president at that time was a young fellow called John Howard, who later went on to bigger and better things. And that view, which John Howard held as a young man in his, I think, early 20s, influenced a lot of the policies that John Howard as Prime Minister either introduced or consolidated during his time as Prime Minister. But I don't want to appear partisan in saying that, because essentially the same policies have been followed by governments of both political persuasions at all levels of government since that major turning point in the early 1960s. And as others have said in the panel discussion, government policies that put cash in the hands of would-be home buyers or exempt them from stamp duty, which allow them to borrow far more than they'd be able to without either government guarantees or government equity participation, policies which allow people who buy properties in order to speculate on increases in their value pay less tax on those increases in their value than they otherwise would. And if it ever comes to it, policies which would allow people to raise their superannuation savings so that they could pay more for housing than they'd otherwise be able to do, including by allowing them to borrow more than they'd otherwise be able to do, all have the same effect. We've got 60 years of evidence that shows that anything that allows Australians to pay more for housing than they'd be able to otherwise results in more expensive housing and a smaller proportion of the population owning it than if governments didn't pursue those policies. And it frankly surprises me that there isn't more anger among younger Australians at the way in which their opportunities to do what their parents and grandparents did at similar stages of their lives have been taken away from them, so that their parents and grandparents continue to get richer. And as our politicians from both sides of politics always show, despite the crocodile tears that they periodically shed for the difficulties faced by aspiring young homebuyers getting into the housing market, what they know is that in any given year there are only ever about 100,000 of them who succeed. And even if you assume that for everyone who does there are, say, 5 or 6 who don't, that's only 600 or 700,000 votes in favour of policies that might restrain the rate of house price inflation. Whereas the same politicians know that at any point in time there are 11 million voters who own their own homes, and that of them there are perhaps 2 or 3 million who own at least one investment property, and the last thing they want is any government policy that might restrain the rate of house price inflation. So, you know, on the one hand 600,000 votes, on the other 11 million, 13 million, even the dumbest of our politicians, and that's not necessarily a small group, can, as the Americans say, do that math. And they do, at every election and in between them. We've got a panel here today of people who aren't necessarily as cynical as I've become about the motives of politicians. That's partly because at least 2 of them are younger than I am. Sorry, Alan. And so I'm going to turn it over to each of them to share their thoughts for about 5 minutes or so, and then Emma is going to put questions to members of the panel which they'll answer. So we've got here today Dr. Tim Helm, who is the Director of Policy and Research with Prosper Australia, a group which has been around for a long time, but you might know better as the Henry George League, which is, since Henry George wrote Progress and Prosperity in the 1890s, has been an advocate for the taxation of economic rents on land. We have Alan Kohler, who probably doesn't need much introduction to you, but to make the point that in his, I think, post-full-time journalist career has written some fabulous stuff about Australia's housing crisis and what to do it, and produced TV programs about that. And then finally we have Maiy Azize, who is the Deputy Director of Anglicare and the Chair of Everyone's Home, who perhaps rarely among young people has been a very forthright and articulate exponent about how Australia's housing crisis is affecting young people and proposing solutions to that I think deserve more attention from politicians on both sides than they've so far got. So after a little bit of consultation with the people in front, we're going to start with Tim and work our way across. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saul, and don't confuse being young with being not cynical. I think the more you understand about the way the economy works, the more reason you have to be cynical, especially when it comes to the role that land plays in our housing markets and in our tax system and in the distribution of income across the economy. So I'm immediately going to depart from what I thought I would talk about right now to just touch on one point following you, Saul, which is the focus on home ownership and the focus on housing asset prices. Because houses are financial assets. They're priced like financial assets, that they capitalise the value of the service or the rent. And so the huge run-up in house prices that we've seen over the last few decades is predominantly an asset pricing effect caused by falling interest rates, stoked also by policy, particularly the change to capital gains calculation. But I think the problem with this increase in house prices, mostly driven by interest rates, is that it's too easy to then focus the conversation on saying we have supplied an inadequate amount of homes to serve demand. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is that the housing market has done a pretty good job at supplying enough housing for 4/5 of the population, the top 4/5 by income, to keep rents as a share of household disposable incomes stable for 30 years. And I think that's an important reframing, because when we talk about a housing crisis, and we're always very loosey-goosey about who this crisis actually applies to, and it's clear that it's in the bottom quintile where rents relative to incomes have risen. To me, it doesn't look like a housing crisis, it looks like inequality It looks like poverty playing out in housing markets, like it does in every market. And we can't really expect housing markets to do better than markets can do. And markets really allocate resources according to the resources that people bring to the market. So there's a really, for me, simple answer to what the tax system can do to promote housing affordability, which is that if we don't want to just build houses as a public sector and give them to people to be adequately housed, we want this to somehow happen through the market. Well, the tax and transfer system is very good at redistributing money from people that have it to people that don't have it. That's simple and quick, as Cassandra pointed out in the last session. And this sort of truth is not spoken enough. I'd like to reiterate what she said. We could deal with housing poverty very quickly if we wanted to, using the tax and transfer system. So I suppose the next point is, I'll talk briefly about the, let's call it the obsession that my think tank, Prosper Australia, focuses on, which is the role of speculation in housing markets. So it is true that supplying more homes, I'll wrap up quickly here, supplying more homes will drive down the price of housing, rents. And that is true. And supplying more homes happens when landowners stop speculating on rising land values and choose to develop their land up to the economic potential. And we have this misconception that there is not many profitable development opportunities going around, and if the public sector could get those taxes on developers out of the way or get those regulations limiting density out of the way, that developers would race to the door to supply housing. This is a misconception of the way land works in housing. We have, at Prosper, we've really chronicled land banking and speculation in many ways, and the short version is that there is plenty of land profitable to redevelop that is not being redeveloped. That is quite rational on the part of the landowner or developer who benefits from rising land prices. Unimproved land is a very good financial asset. And this behaviour, this speculation or land banking, it's the opposite of housing supply, right? So we're constantly talking about how we can get more supply of housing, but we somehow refuse to let into the conversation this idea that speculation, this activity of land banking and even holding built property back from the market, as we see with new builds, as we see with the empty homes that we count. This activity is the private sector's own speed limit on housing supply. It's not a regulatory speed limit. So why does that matter for tax? Well, the tax system at every turn is encouraging this behaviour. If you're a developer and you put some rental housing on your land and you rent it out, well, you're taxed on that full income from the rental. If you leave that land idle and the land grows in value, you pay a concessional rate of tax. And if you're a landowner like mum and dad, and this land sits under the house that you currently occupy, well, you don't pay any tax at all. And this is staggering when we sit back and think about it, that those who go out and expend their effort and their energy or their entrepreneurial skill, or they do something productive with themselves or with their land, are taxed on the income they get from that productive activity. And those who leave assets idle and benefit from these passive incomes, we call it capital gains, it's land gains, of course, they are concessionally taxed. I mean, there's no reason we shouldn't be taxing land gains at up to 100%. There's no positive incentive that receiving an unearned increment on your land value, there's no incentive that creates for productive activity. So overall, we at Prosper would call for everybody to recognise the inherently sort of sterile aspect of land gains as a source of income. It's an unearned income, and we're looking for all politicians to be looking at tax reform proposals through the lens of, is this shifting tax off productive activity like building construction, investment, work, employment, entrepreneurship, and is it shifting taxation onto incomes derived from passive asset holding, predominantly owning land and watching it rise in value? Are we shifting taxes from really unearned incomes shifting taxes off earned incomes onto unearned incomes? And if we can stop the tax system prioritising speculative income from land over income derived from productive activity, we can actually generate more private sector housing supply. We can get the incentives in place for developers to invest more and for more housing to be supplied. So there's a way the tax system, I suppose, to wrap up, can directly solve housing affordability, and that's giving money to the people that can't afford housing, adequate housing. And there's another way we can do it too, which is to stop tying one hand behind our back when it comes to generating an increased supply of housing. We're currently tying one hand behind our back because every time you supply more housing, you pay more tax. At the margin, that makes a difference to decisions. So we would call on politicians to recognise the role of this land banking speculative behaviour in housing supply and think about how the tax system is currently making that supply more difficult.
Thank you, Tim. Alan.
That was really good.
I hope so. Thank you.
So I think I'm here because, partly because I wrote a quarterly essay which turned into a book about housing, which has been out there for 18 months now. So I thought I'd just take you through slightly how I approached that and what I came to. As you may know, I have a thing about graphs, and so so when I was assigned to write that essay, I sort of thought, well, I'll start by looking at some graphs as to so I could try to understand what had happened to house prices and when it had happened. So I thought that if I could figure out when it happened, maybe that'll lead to the conclusion of why. And so the first graph I got was from the Grattan Institute, which showed the house price to income ratio. That's the median house price to average income. And it was quite clear that it was basically flat up until the year 2000 and then started to rise sharply from that time onwards and has continued to do so since the year 2000. And I got another graph of house price to GDP, and the same thing. It was flat, more or less, with some ups and downs up until 2000, and then after 2000, house price to GDP took off. So I thought, okay, well then, in order to write this thing, I've got to investigate what happened in 2000. To cut a long story short, I found there were four things that happened. There was a business tax review appointed by Peter Costello in 1999, headed by John Ralph, the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank. The purpose of that review was to provide John Howard and Peter Costello with cover to reduce the company tax rate from 36 to 30%. That's what they that's what they decided they wanted to do, but they needed some people to say that was a good idea. So unsurprisingly, the business people on the panel said it was a good idea, but they also, unbidden, recommended that the capital gains tax, the current system with the current capital gains tax, which had been in place since 1985, the deal was that you added the capital gain to your income minus the effect of inflation. And they recommended that you replace the inflation adjustment with a simple 50% deduction. So that was the first thing that happened. That was actually done in the end of 1999. So Costello accepted that and did it. The other thing that happened was that the stock market, the US stock market crashed in March 2000. And so just back to that business tax review, they kind of said that the reason for doing this capital gains tax adjustment was to encourage people to invest in shares, which would boost productivity, lead to higher share price and so on. So they framed it as a recommendation around companies and shares rather than property. The trouble was that after the stock market crashed in the US in March 2000, nobody wanted to have anything to do with shares anymore. So there was even without there being a capital gains tax adjustment, everyone got out of the stock market basically in the year 2000. And also the Reserve Bank cut interest rates after that 3 times, even though there wasn't a recession, because they were frightened that there would be, so they cut interest rates. And the Federal Reserve was cutting interest rates because there was a recession in the US. So you had the sort of non-recessionary interest rate cuts, stock market crash. The other thing was that John Howard, Saul mentioned first home buyer grants, which began back in Menzie's time at John Howard's recommendation. They'd been had been neglected for a while, but John Howard reintroduced them in the year 2000. And as Saul has eloquently written many times, all that happens with that is it just goes on the price. And so it sort of encourages people to buy more. The other thing that happened, which I didn't fully understand when I wrote the book, is that immigration doubled after 2005 and then tripled a couple of years later. And what I subsequently learned was that the reason for that was that on July the 1st, 2000, the government changed the way that student visas work. Up until that point, student visas were divided between gazetted countries and non-gazetted countries. And students from gazetted countries just sailed through, got a place in an Australian university, no problems. Those in non-gazetted countries found it virtually impossible. And I think that was a sort of hangover from the White Australia policy, and quite rightly that was removed. The distinction between gazetted and non-gazetted countries was removed. And basically that opened the door to Australian universities to students from China and India. Subsequently, foreign students have become the most important part of our immigration intake. The huge increase in immigration that occurred sort of a few years after that, as a result of that, I think partly, had a lot to do with basically a 10-year shortfall of housing that occurred between. If you look at the charts, there's an economist called Shane Oliver at AMP produces a chart of supply and demand, or surplus and shortage of housing, and there was a shortage between 2005 and 2015, which I think can be to some extent put down to the big increase in immigration that occurred then, and it sort of declined a bit after 2015. So those are the four things that happened. I mean, here we are. House prices have, since 2000, been increasing at roughly 6% or 7% per annum, while incomes have been rising at 3 to 4% per annum, and 6 or 7% compound over 25 years has resulted in the average house price to income ratio rising from 3 to 4 times to 9 times, which means that it's virtually impossible now for the average family to buy the average home. In fact, the average home is now out of reach for the average family. And it's become a sort of obviously a political issue, and the focus of the politics is on supply, which we can get into, I guess, if you want to, but I might leave it there. And over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Hey.
Thank you, Saul, and thank you especially for your description of me as a young person. I think I'm going to... That's made my day. I'm very excited about that. I agree with everything that's been said, but I'm just going to do a yes and. So I'd like to sort of start by thinking about what housing in Australia looked like back when it was affordable, because we used to have quite affordable housing in Australia. After the Second World War, we had governments, Labor governments actually, that basically built social housing in Australia from the ground up, and we followed a pretty similar trajectory to a lot of other comparable countries after the Second World War, where the way governments decided to intervene to make housing more affordable was to just supply housing quite directly. And Alan has all sorts of great numbers about that in his fantastic quarterly essay. At the high point of building, about 1 in 4 new builds was being built by the government in Australia, and right up until the early 80s, about 1 in 3 renters was renting from the government. So this was a really big part of why housing used to be very affordable in Australia. What we saw in the 70s and 80s was a real change in mentality, and again, this followed we followed a similar trajectory to other countries, where countries sort of started looking around and thinking, why is the government supplying so much housing? And this came to be seen as a real problem. On the previous panel, we heard a little bit about Henderson and the Henderson poverty line. In 1975, the Big Henderson Poverty Report had a really problematic chapter in it about housing. I don't want to impugn the legacy of Henderson. You know, he's a real giant in social welfare policy in Australia, but he's got a really mixed legacy on housing, and it identified as a real problem that public housing in Australia was quote unquote badly targeted. and that so many people who were in public housing were working people. And it's true, a lot of people who were in public housing at that time were public servants, construction workers, teachers, all sorts of people used to live in social housing. And so we saw a real change in orientation from the 70s, 80s onwards. We saw the federal government really step back from providing housing directly, and in the late 90s and 2000s we saw another big turn to really subsidising and underwriting private investors to become our main suppliers of housing. And we know they're doing that through the tax system. And I mean, Alan has gone over all of the ways that that's really pushed up house prices, but I think one of the factors that's really underappreciated in that is that it's also had a really big impact on rents. If you look at how much rents have gone up in the past 25 years, since 2000, we've regularly seen asking rents increase in the order of 5 to 10% every single year. And it's hard to attribute, it's hard to attribute kind of causality to that. But I really think it's got something to do with the fact that so many landlords used to be positively geared, and many more landlords now are negatively geared and very highly leveraged. And these are the kinds of people that we've basically lured in to become our main suppliers of housing in Australia, when the government used to be a major supplier of housing in Australia. So for me, a big part of the solution, absolutely, is tax and fixing the tax system and stopping housing from being this investment vehicle that it's become. But it's also about turning back to government as a supplier of housing, looking to social housing as a solution. When we look around the world at the countries that have either avoided their housing crises altogether or managed to turn them around, there aren't a lot of them, but there are some, they are countries where the government is a major supplier of housing. So we need to be looking at that.
Thank you, Maiy. So you've heard from each of our three panellists. Emma, you're going to facilitate the questions coming from people here in the room and out in the ether.
I am. If I can borrow your microphone, I'll hand it straight back. Thank you all very much. Very enlightening and informative conversation about a topic we all feel really strongly about. I'm going to start with a question of my own. It's a bit of a cheeky one. When Peter Costello introduced the capital gains tax discount in 1999, how many times did he mention housing?
I don't know. Do you know?
None.
None, right.
None. I mean, the point Costello said, echoing Ralph, was that this much more favourable treatment of capital gains would turn Australia into a nation of shareholders and entrepreneurs. That is to say, more people would run their own businesses and more people would have a direct stake in other businesses. What happened, of course, over the following 25 years was that the number of people who were direct holders in shares fell to such a low proportion of the population that the ASX stopped surveying them every year in about 2013. And despite what politicians of both sides say, the proportion of the workforce who are owner-managers of their own businesses also declined. What it did instead was to turn us into a nation of property speculators, even more than we originally were. And one other little detail that's forgotten is that when the then opposition agreed to vote for these changes in the Senate, and they needed the opposition's votes to get them through, the quid pro quo was, as I think Ken can affirm, that the government would tax trusts as companies. And Costello and Howard welched on the deal. Welched on it. Under pressure from the National Party, of course, whose members are up to the gills in that. But it's interesting that someone referred earlier to Joe Hockey and some of the things he, in very poor taste, said about why people were unable to buy homes. He was, of course, also a fervent advocate of retaining negative gearing, and he would relate the falsehoods that his father, among others, who was a real estate agent, or at least was invested in real estate, about what allegedly happened between 85 and 87 when negative gearing was temporarily abolished. But he had, and I don't like this analogy for what might be obvious reasons, a road to Damascus-like conversion in his valedictory speech to Parliament when he actually said, we should have abolished negative gearing and taxed trusts as companies. He's one of the few people who would have had the power to do it, but he didn't while he did.
often the way, really, isn't it? People seem
Probably
to
worth mentioning, just on that capital gains tax discount, that when it was introduced, when they discounted the capital gains tax by 50%, and it replaced the inflation adjustment, there probably wasn't a lot in it between the inflation adjustment and the 50% discount. Inflation was quite high then, so for the average time that people held an asset, the inflation adjustment was probably at or close to 50%. So it wasn't that much in 1999, 2000, it wasn't that much of a benefit. It's become a benefit since then as inflation has fallen, particularly between the GFC and the pandemic, when inflation was running at below 2%. Averaged for that period of time, the inflation rate was 1.6%. So you would have had to, in order to equal a 50% deduction, you'd have to own the asset for 30 years or something. And so I think that the Labor Party's proposal to halve the discount to 25% in 2016 and 2019 was merely, or should have been seen as merely a recognition that inflation had fallen.
In a logical world, yes. This all then leads me into a question from the floor or from the live stream, because of course, as you said, Maiy, these tax changes encouraged ordinary working households to become landlords. Any spare capital, put it into property. Tax system doesn't reward you for doing much else. So one of the questions here is the policy debate's focused on home ownership. Should we be refocusing the debate on redesigning the rental market so it's less dependent on mum and dad investors, which leads to that insecurity and volatility? Anyone?
I think that would require, and it should require, getting rid of negative gearing. The main thing that encourages individuals to own property is, I think, in my view, negative gearing, and that's not available to institutional owners of housing. And the government's now introduced what they call a build-to-rent policy to try to encourage institutions to own housing, and they're doing that by increasing the depreciation allowance to 4%, but they need to do more than that, I think. Yeah.
I think in 2019 and 2016, Labor had a bit of an agenda to start doing some of that, actually, by winding back the tax concessions, but also they had a very ambitious proposal to build 300,000 social and affordable rentals. As someone who campaigns for social housing now, that is, you know, I look back on that and it's just so sad that we missed the opportunity to get that. We've now got a government that's got a target of 30,000, which really isn't even going to replace the social housing that we're set to lose over the next 5 years. 300,000 would have been a life-changing amount of social and affordable housing and really get us on the way to what we need to do. So yeah, institutional investors are part of the picture, but I mean, as I said before, the way to really bring down rents is to really build up social housing and make that an option for more people and more working people, not just make it a very highly targeted safety net.
Just to amplify something Maiy said in her earlier remarks, Australia's very much an outlier among so-called advanced economies in that our rental housing stock is overwhelmingly owned by what politicians like to call mums and dads trying to get ahead. In most other advanced economies, the rental housing stock is owned by some combination that varies from country to country of governments, not-for-profits or charities. In some European countries, churches own a lot of rental housing, for example, and in the US and Canada in particular, companies set up for the explicit purpose of building, owning and managing rental housing. Now that has, I think, two profound implications. One, in those other countries, the motive for owning and managing rental housing stock is either a social mission to provide housing for people who can't afford it or to generate income from rents. It is not capital gains because they don't ever intend to sell it. And that includes in North America, where a lot of it is owned by corporates, but for the purpose of managing and owning rental housing. The second thing is, of course, that none of those entities who own most of the rental housing stock in other countries, that is governments, not-for-profits, churches and companies, none of them are on the electoral roll. Whereas in Australia, you've got 3 million, potentially, people who are on the electoral roll who vote and who will vote against not only any proposals to reduce the generous tax treatment they get, but also vote against any proposals to give tenants more security or more rights, for example, to keep pets or hang pictures or make minor repairs. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why Australian tenants have fewer rights, including to security of tenure, than in other so-called advanced economies, is because there is a vast difference between the political power of landlords in this country and in most other advanced economies.
Interestingly, our 2024 tax survey we've asked the question about negative gearing now for about 8 or 9 years. And we found this year only 15% of people believe it should be left as is. It was 30% in the 2023 survey. And so support for negative gearing has come crashing down during the current rental crisis, it would seem. Question for you, perhaps this one, Tim. How much evidence, or is there evidence of how much land banking goes on?
Definitely a question for me. Thank you, Emma. So the evidence is not as good as it should be because you don't find evidence unless you go looking for it. We at Prosper have, I suppose, led the way in going to look for this. For example, in the greenfields, we have reports that show, for instance, major subdivision owners will drip feed housing lots for sale to the market over around 30 to 40 years. They price high enough that that will be the sales rate. It'll take them 30 to 40 years to sell out that subdivision. That's entirely rational. Now, to really hammer the point, they could sell, at best there are sheep on the grass. They could sell those lots for housing at any price above what it costs to put in some roads and local pipes and the rest. They don't. They price much higher than that, and therefore the sales rates of that property are very slow. So this is land banking. It's the clearest example. If you walk around the city and you see a vacant lot that's not being developed, and it's just being held for sale, and some developer is complaining that they cannot buy vacant lots at a price where they can make a buck, that's land banking too. And that's the market doing a very rational thing in a way by holding this resource, land, until the time when it's privately optimal to develop it. You don't want to prematurely develop it. If the sales rates from built housing, when you put that in the bank and you get a lower rate of return than you would have got on the land. So land banking's everywhere, but it's unacknowledged. It's sort of the sort of dark matter of the economy because the economists don't look at it. They don't see it. And in fact, in an economics training, and I promise I have an economics training, this doesn't exist. Everything is fully used all the time and no one really thinks about the future and withholds something from use. But one of the really key insights from a lot of economics that got lost is that with land, there is an optimal timing to develop it. You harvest that land for housing the same way you might harvest a forest for timber, which is to say you are attentive to the value of the stock that remains and you're focused on maximising your balance sheet. So this is everywhere. And the really key point is when you look at the rates of properties that could be feasibly turned into housing, the change of use is profitable, and how many are actually turned into housing, then every year it's a tiny fraction, maybe 3-5%. You have, say, the Municipal Association of Victoria last year put out a report showing there's 120,000 homes in Melbourne, and that's about 2 years new supply, that are approved for building. They've got building approval, and they haven't yet commenced. And they're being voluntarily delayed from production in order to maximise the sales prices when they are developed and sold. And you have tall apartment towers that are, for example, the Jewel Tower on the Gold Coast, as the ABC reported on, that are sold slowly, deliberately. They're not released. They're not even released to be sold. And you do that because you don't want to flood the market and depress the price of housing. You've got this asset of a house or some land. You want to maximise the value of the asset. Now, why this really matters is that we have a public conversation that, in my view, has become obsessively focused on the planning system as the limit on the supply of housing. And it's a really weird argument when you think about it, that limits on how tall you can build new houses are somehow limiting the pace at which people choose to turn land into housing. There's no public sector limit on how many of those vacant lots are converted into housing. There's no public sector limit on how many of those approved greenfield subdivisions are sold in any given year. So actually private sectors limit housing supply, and we're being sold a real myth here that it's the public sector limiting housing supply. Now, why are we being sold that myth? A quick look at who benefits from land rezoning will tell you very clearly. And the idea is that if we can relax regulations on land, if we can lobby for upzoning, then the value of your land goes up. So I suppose what we want to see is it's completely ludicrous, right, that by lobbying for your land to, land use controls on your land to be removed, you get to make a lot of money. But by developing that land according to the law as it stands, whatever density that specifies, you get taxed on that. So we're doing the tax system completely wrong in so many aspects. So straight away, there's a really easy way to capture so-called capital gains, and that is rezoning charges. So Victoria did a good job. They've got a rezoning windfall gains tax. The ACT has something similar. And I suppose when it comes to the federal government could make value capture, so-called value capture, a precondition of any infrastructure funding very simply and easily. There's so much that could be raised. Calculations we did show you could replace stamp duty with the amount of capital gain given away through rezoning every year in the States. So that's yes, there is land banking.
Inevitably, time has gotten away from us. We could no doubt devote another hour or so to this conversation, but we're not allowed to do that, are we, Emma? I just note in finishing, Emma, you said when you were speaking earlier this morning that you found yourself surprised to be quoting Scott Morrison. I'm always surprised to be quoting a communist dictator when I refer to Xi Jinping saying, as he often does, that houses should be for living in, not for speculation. And on that score, if not for any other, I'd agree with him. But what I also say is that I have a very strong suspicion that Sir Robert Menzies would have said the same thing. And on that note, it's lunchtime, isn't it? Yeah. Not quite. Okay.
Thank you very much, Saul. And thank you to our panellists, Maiy, Azize, Alan Kohler, Tim Helm.